Hello, yes, a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening to you, however you may be listening and wherever you may be listening. This is the latest edition of the Baldwin Sports Media NFL podcast, coming to you after what has certainly been a very interesting week, both on and off the pitch. Yesterday, as I called this, yesterday was, of course, the NFL trade deadline. And boy, oh boy, did that give us plenty to talk about. More than I thought many people would have imagined at the start of the day. Certainly plenty of deals, but there were one or two that certainly stole the headlines, shall we say. And don't worry, we will get into all of that. But before we do, I do need to do the admin for the show, which is, as always, just simple as saying thank you very much for listening to us. If you are new, then don't forget you can like and subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment as well. Hit the bell icon, everything you need to do on YouTube to make sure you keep getting this content. And don't forget that we are also on our other social medias. We are at Baldwin Sports Media on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And we are on Twitter at MRB Sports Media. So feel free to give us a follow or whatever it is you need to do on those channels there. And if you are a returning listener, then as always, thank you so much for listening and continuing to make me just a little part of your week. Right, and with that, we shall get into the show. Now, first, I do want to touch on what has been the biggest story of the week concerning the NFL and, a few other things as well. But the NFL has been the main driver of this, and that is the dispute that's going on between YouTube TV and Google and Disney and everything that's sort of going along there. The reason I'm sort of vague about this because I really don't know exactly what the details are. I know that there's withholding service and everything, but I've never quite understood why, you've seen the ESPN personalities on social media plugging them to say, I don't know if it's a petition that you have to sign or go to keep our networks or whatever, because Disney and Hulu and all that company has taken programming away from YouTube TV, and that's meant the NFL, that's meant ABC, that's meant ESPN, and all that sort of stuff. I personally, I think I've sort of showed this attitude before. I'm not really that fussed because I have Fubo, so this doesn't really impact me in any way so far. But and everything that goes on about it. Why is it on the? This is a comment I've seen. Why is it on the little people? The consumer to have to deal with this and send messages to the representatives and to the network saying, hey, sort this out. This should be on them to just sort it out. I don't understand why we are being dragged into this. So that's just my view, is that I don't really have a view. I'm not really smart enough to know what's going on, and even if I was, it's still just something I'm not really concerned about just because of I feel sorry for anyone who is missing out on the NFL and everything else that goes on ABC and Disney channels and whatever as a result of this. I do feel sorry, but it's just I don't know because I don't care because I don't have that system. So I just want to touch on that. I am aware of it, but it just doesn't concern me right now. Right. We do need to get on to the big news, which was the trade deadline. And there's only really one place you can start, and that is the New York Jets. Now, obviously, their moves on deadline day, on trade deadline day, show that they have given up. They are tanking that. I mean, I think we pretty much everyone knew this already, but they are kicking the can down the road yet again. This season isn't working. Whether or not they thought it could work, it's just not going to work. So it's to kick things down the road. And they've decided to move on from Sauce Gardner and Quinnen Williams. Quinnen Williams going to the Cowboys in exchange for a second round pick, a first round pick, and Mozzie Smith as well. I don't really think Mozzie Smith really plays into it, but that's what they're doing as well. And then obviously the big news is Sauce Gardner to the Indianapolis Colts. Now I've touched on the Jets side of this. I don't really want to spend more on them than I need to. Just shows how bad of an organization they are run, and I don't think that the draft picks are going to come to anything because this is the Jets. When have they ever shown to be any level of competent to make you think that they are going to turn those picks into something? Dallas Cowboys, I'll touch on them first. Getting Quinnen Williams is somewhat trying to compensate for the loss of Micah Parsons. What has everyone been saying about the Cowboys is, God, they'd be a great team if they had a great defensive, end edge rush or whatever to try and stop the run and play, have a star on defense. They have gone and got one in Quinnen Williams. I do like that. It is somewhat overcompensating. They shouldn't have let Micah Parsons go in the first place, but that is what it is. Now for the Indianapolis Colts. And I can't remember who it was that saw this. I saw this on Twitter last night, but it kind of put into words better than I could have what exactly this means. Is the Colts are now officially all in, not only on this season, because they obviously think they can win, and if they are going into the playoffs, they are going to need a shutdown corner to stop Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or Aaron Rodgers or Justin Herbert or any of the other options. Name who you want. They are going to Lamar Jackson with Zay Flowers and whatever. They are going to need someone to shut down one side of the field, and that is what Sauce Gardner brings you. But the fact they gave up so much for him, 2 first-round picks and a wide receiver, but 2 first-round draft picks, tells you that they are fine with Daniel Jones at quarterback. Because with the draft capital that they had, they'd have kept him, there could very easily have been a conversation to be had that Daniel Jones is just an intermediate guy. Anthony Richardson, his time is done, which by the way I think this pretty much confirms his time is done in Indianapolis. But there is no way that they are going to go into next year's draft or the draft after that looking to draft a quarterback. So they are fine with Daniel Jones. And again, they believe they are all in because they have got a lockdown player on defense, and the offense is humming, and that's going to, had a bit of a stumble this past week, but for the most part, this is an offense and now a team that could go and win a Super Bowl. I personally don't think they are going to win the Super Bowl, but I applaud them for at least trying and showing some intent that they are going to do that. So kudos to them for that. The other big trade news that I saw that kind of took me by surprise was Logan Wilson rather, going from the Bengals to the Cowboys. Now, Logan Wilson's made it clear that he wants out of the Bengals. And again, the way they've been, I don't really blame them. If he thinks that this isn't the year, then so be it. He has every right to say, he wants to move on. But it was Dan Patrick that pointed out that it seems weird for the Cowboys to want to go after Logan Wilson because the Bengals are not the best. We've seen them this season, are far from the best defense in the NFL. And your solution to the Dallas Cowboys, because they need some improvement as well, is to go and get someone from a team that is far worse than you. It doesn't quite make sense, but maybe there's a situation where, like with quarterbacks, once they get a good fit and they get into a better team and with a better surroundings, then maybe they'll be able to, flourish a little bit more. Logan Wilson was far from the problem with the Bengals. But I do think it goes to show again, the Dallas Cowboys, they are all in. They need to do something to stop the defense or to stop the defense being so porous. This is their way that they're going to do it. And, again, kudos to them for being brave. Those were really the big names when it came to the trade deadline. There were a couple of others, obviously, in the days preceding, like the Steelers moved, traded for Carl Duggar from the Patriots. And there were a couple of others. I do want to say the Raiders trade for Jacoby Myers, which I don't really think is that big of a deal. Jacoby Myers is a very good wide receiver. I'm not trying to downplay his talents, but going to the Jaguars again, the way that the Jaguars have been this season, do I really want to buy into whether or not this is a similar to Sauce Gardner move, one that's going to take them over the top? No, I particularly don't, but I will say for them to get a fourth for him, I think that's pretty good business on the Jacksonville Jaguars. On the Jaguars side, I think that's a pretty astute deal. The Eagles getting bigger, or getting better, rather by getting Jalen Phillips from the Dolphins. I think again, that's a case of the rich getting richer. Raheem Shaheed to the Seahawks, meh. I can kind of understand the hype, but I'm not really going to get too much on it. But those are really the big deals of trade deadline day, and I will go back and I will reiterate what I have been saying over the past couple of months and years is I do think that rather than having to completely blow up your franchise, I do think we need to bring the loan system in. So rather than the Jets, I mean, they've done very well to accumulate the picks they have, but rather than just blowing up your franchise as a result, you could still just loan Sauce Gardner to the Colts for the rest of the year. You don't have to, and the Colts don't have to give up 2 firsts. They can give up, a third and a fourth, say, and still get Sauce Gardner for the rest of the year. I think it's an idea that needs to go. But I've said that too much. But that is what happened on trade deadline day and in the preceding days. I think pretty good. But I think there's only really one or two deals that really stood out. I know people say it was a crazy wild day, but really it was only crazy and wild because of those two deals, Sauce Gardner and Quinn Williams. Right, moving on to in effect, I've jumped ahead and gone into the roundup, but I will say that I want to talk about one big thing from the weekend, and that was it ended up playing a big part. And that was the Buffalo Bills and Kansas City Chiefs game. The big game, the one that everyone looks forward to every year, and all that. And brilliant game. Well done, Josh Allen, for beating Patrick Mahomes in the regular season. Again, let's wait and see what happens when it comes to the postseason before everyone starts to think that the torch has been passed or whatever. But one big moment in the game really stood out to me, and that's the intentional grounding call on Patrick Mahomes. Now, I will say the NFL did not cover itself in glory here because of the way the referees were chatting to Andy Reid about it, which I get has to happen because the referee goes and explains the rule or whatever. But when they were umming and ahhing about whether or not to call the intentional grounding, which it shouldn't have been, by the way, that's the point we'll get to. But when they called into, or were going to call intentional grounding and they were discussing it, when a referee goes over and talks like that, I can tell there was a certain percentage of America that was saying, "Oh, they're going to take it away from him. This is the Chiefs, getting favorable referee calls again." I just think again, the optics just need to be slightly better. Again, I know it has to be done, but the way the social media is, and I know the NFL can't control social media and the conspiracy theorists, but in my mind, I just knew that was someone in America was thinking that. But back to intentional grounding, which should not have been because the ball was deflected, whatever you can. No. I do think the intentional grounding rule does need to be looked at because when you look at it in its essence, it's a rule that just should not exist. Let's point out how, intentional grounding. It should be your choice. If you don't think the play is there to be made, you have the ball. It's if you just think it's not going to happen, then fine, just don't do anything. Throw it into the ground. It doesn't matter. They can do it in certain situations if they're outside the tackle box and the ball goes past the line of scrimmage or whatever. Then they let that go. Yet for some reason, in an instance like that, where there was some debate, was intentional grounding, it got tipped, was it, the tip could have infected the route and then the ball could have traveled to, I can't remember who the wide receiver was, and Patrick Mahomes may have got away with it if the ball wasn't. It just doesn't quite make sense when you boil it down to its essence. And when you imagine the lawmakers sitting round and deciding, right, this is what we're going to do, this intentional grounding, we've come up with this rule where you are allowed to throw the ball away in certain circumstances, but if a quarterback is under pressure, basically running for his life effectively, there's no play, but he doesn't want to lose yards, he can't just throw the ball into the ground. It doesn't make sense, especially if, throwing the ball away, throwing the ball, it can be up to interpretation. I remember a couple of years ago in the Super Bowl, the Patriots and it was the Giants, it was the second time. Tom Brady got called for intentional grounding in the end zone, but if you looked at the game, and I remember some of the discourse afterwards, it was no, the receiver ran the wrong route. He was meant to cut right, but he cut left or whatever it was. I can't remember the exact, but but Tom Brady got called for intentional grounding when it wasn't his fault. When he was in the pocket, he was under duress, but he threw the ball away. But the wide receiver ran the wrong route, but he gets called for intentional grounding. But it wasn't intentional. He was just trying to make a play, just like Patrick Mahomes was trying to make a play. But the interpretation of it leaves it up to whatever, and he gets penalised for it. But a quarterback spike to think that is intentional grounding. How is that one of the weird loopholes that you are in the pocket, the ball didn't go past the line of scrimmage, but a spike is allowed. But if you're under pressure, then throwing the ball, spiking the ball into the ground that's intentional grounding, but spike. Just when you look at it at its basic element, it does not make sense. It's like I've said with soccer. Just when they were devising the rule about the throw in. Right, okay, this is football, soccer. You aren't allowed to use your hands. Okay, fine, we get that. It's called football. The goalkeeper is could be he can use it to stop the ball and only within the box. Okay, fine, we get that. When the ball goes out behind the goal, you get a corner and you can kick it in. Okay, fine. But if the ball goes out on the sideline, you have to throw it in. Just when you boil it down to that, it doesn't quite make sense. It's the same with intentional grounding. I think that is a rule that either needs to go completely or be severely changed. I do think, whether or not it's an entertainment thing, because the NFL doesn't want a play just to be blown dead straight away. They want to at least try and have something, whether it be a miraculous quarterback scramble away or a sack or whatever. But the intentional grounding rule, as it is, it doesn't quite make sense, and I don't think it's fit for purpose, especially if you have controversial moments like that. That very well can influence the outcome of the game. The Kansas City Chiefs lose by 7 points. Who's to know what happens on that drive if things are going in their rhythm, they don't lose the yards and the downs and all that stuff on that play? Who's to know? So potentially game changing. I think it does need to be looked at severely. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do we need to change the intentional grounding rule to make it not necessarily make more sense, but make more sense is probably the best way to put it, or at least make it more consistent across the board. Let's put it that way. Should we change the intentional grounding rule? Right, and with that, we move on to the roundup portion of the week. And I touched on Bills, Chiefs. I will just say it again. I don't really want to buy or build or whatever it is into this for the Chiefs or the Bills, rather, because we know what happens when it comes to the postseason. That it is a completely different animal. Now, I will say, I do think the Chiefs are running out of leverage when it comes to their hopes of being at home for as much of the playoffs as they can. We know that every single time the Chiefs have only in the Patrick Mahomes era have only had that one playoff game on the road, and that was against the Ravens a couple of years ago. And they won it, and that was always a thing of they can only win at home, yada yada yada. But if they are now staring down the possibility of being a six or seven seed, where they're going to have to play multiple games on the road, if they don't catch up, if they don't win back games in the division against the Broncos and the Chargers, they are staring down having to go on the road, or maybe even, I don't think it's going to happen, but they are also staring down the possibility of missing the playoffs altogether. So the Chiefs, whilst we think they will be okay in the playoffs, need to make sure that they get there in the first place. But as I say, they are running out of wiggle room when it comes to that. As for the Bills, again, a good statement, but we know that it's not really going to mean anything just yet. Let's just wait and see what happens. This is in no particular order. I've just put this in the order that I sort of mentally had the notes come to me. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Cam Little's record, the kicker for the Jacksonville Jaguars, setting the NFL record for longest field goal. I think everyone knew that this was likely going to come when he kicked a 70-yarder in the preseason. So, it didn't count officially in the record books, but we know that it was possible for him. Now to hold that record, now it's going to be very interesting to see who's the next person to break that record. It may even be him. If things go right, if they have to play in Denver, I don't know if they do this season, but maybe further, a couple of seasons down the line, they may go, he may be able to break that record. But good for him for setting it. And now the target is basically on everyone's mind is whether or not anyone, even him, can do it from 70. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. Dan Quinn, the head coach of the Commanders, on the decision to leave Jaden Daniels in and basically saying he owns it. Yeah, he does kind of own it. It has always baffled me the lengths that coaches will keep players in. And I know there may be some sort of battle between the coach and the player the player will never voluntarily bring themselves out. But I do think the coach does need to have a lot more say in when a player comes out, because that is exactly what happens in Jaden Daniels' situation, probably out for the year, and who knows what impact that's going to have on him moving forward his NFL career. There have been times where, what's the famous clip of like Peyton Manning and I think it was Brock Osweiler in the background, when Peyton Manning, I think they're up against I've seen the clip so many times. I want to say it was against the Raiders when Manning was with the Broncos, and they're up, I think, like 55-10 in the fourth quarter. And Peyton Manning trots out to Brock Osweiler, who thinks he's getting in, grabs his helmet, sees Peyton trotting out and says, "Oh, no, it's not my turn yet." In that situation, yes, take Peyton Manning out of the game. I think in the situation that the Washington Commanders were in, should have taken Jaden Daniels out a lot sooner, and now you see the impact. So I do think coaches do need to be a little bit more aware of the situation and just pull guys out for safety. The Arizona Cardinals, despite their very good win over the Dallas Cowboys on Monday, have decided they're going to move on with Jacoby Brissett as the starter. Now, head coach Jonathan Gannon did say that even if Kyler Murray was healthy, he's said to be out for a little bit, he did tell reporters that even if Murray was healthy, that Brissett would still be the starter. I think we may be looking at the end of Kyler Murray in Arizona. I was never one to buy into the hype of Kyler Murray. I get that he has he has some good splashes and good flashes. I get that, but I just don't think he was ever the guy to get the big contract that he did. And I think, again, the performance level does not quite match the contract, and that has held back the Arizona Cardinals for a while. And I just think it's time. I just think it's time to move on again. What they're going to do, how they're going to do it with the contract, I don't know. But I think there will be someone who's willing to take him as a backup and maybe willing to trade for him if they can. Again, if they can finagle something, work out with the contract. I think someone will want to take a second chance on him, use him as a bridge quarterback or whatever. But I think his time with the Arizona Cardinals is pretty much over at this point. And finally, again, one of the big ones was the Chicago Bears and their epic game against the Cincinnati Bengals. And if you are a Bengals fan, I touched on it earlier with the Logan Wilson trade. You just have to wonder, is anything ever going to go right? If you can't hold on in that situation, if that defense cannot hold on in that situation, you really do have to wonder what is the point of pretty much anything this season. Because to lose in a fashion like that, I don't think there's any way that you can come back from it. Kudos to the Bears for doing it, but it takes two to tango in this situation. And if the Bengals can't hold on in that situation after making that incredible comeback, and you saw the winning touchdown, it was just not even a lack of effort, but when you are missing that many tackles to make that happen, or to allow that to happen, then that is a really, really big problem. And again, I don't see there's any way that the Bengals. How do you flip a switch and get things sorted after that? I just don't see it. And finally, just to end up with a more light-hearted story of the week, and this one takes to the world of soccer and the English FA Cup, and some footage that has emerged of St Albans City and the mascot Sammy the Saint. They were playing away at Burton Albion, a club I know very well, having reported on them a couple of times in my university days. But the club mascot, St Albans, were the away team, and they brought their mascot with them because the FA Cup is a big day for them. And basically, the mascot and the person inside the suit appears to have been a little bit drunk. And he's falling over the sides. He's acting a little bit weird. And not that I'm condoning this in any way, but I do urge you to go and check out the film. It is quite funny. Whether or not he was drunk or just playing a part, because I think one aspect that does need to be considered in this is Burton Albion is home of a lot of English breweries. In fact, the nickname of Burton Albion is called the Brewers because there's so many. So maybe he was just playing up a little bit, insisting or insinuating that he was drunk and he wasn't really. But either way, just quite funny. Hopefully, he didn't cause anyone any harm except for maybe himself. But just pretty funny to see the length that some mascots will go to in order to get a laugh out of fans. But that is it. That is it for the show. I want to thank you very much, as always, for listening. Don't forget, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon, be part of the conversation in any way that you can. And that involves going to our social medias. We are at Border Sports Media on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And on Twitter, we are at MRB Sports Media. So feel free to check those out. If you are new, then thank you very much for listening. And if you are a returner, then as always, thank you very much for your continued support. We will be back next week. Probably not talking about as big or controversial or as blockbuster, as someone would say, day in the NFL, but certainly with plenty of off and on-field topics to talk about. So I look forward to welcoming you back for that. So all that's left for me to say is to take care, and as always, stay safe. See you next week.